Welcome to Justice, a podcast all about self-care, wellness, and social justice at a big age. I am Tashira Halyard.
And I'm Margo Lindauer.
We are back for another episode, friend.
We are.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good.
You can't say good. We have to use descriptive words to describe our feelings.
I'm feeling really excited about this episode.
I love it.
How about you?
I am feeling well rested. I slept good in your daughter's bed last night, in Ella's bed. Although my feet were hanging off the bottom of it.
And that's a bed that's been passed down for many generations, as has the mattress. So you're a good sport. Okay, we love it when you stay with us.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to jump in because we have a lot going on today. Can you tell us a little bit about our sponsor?
Absolutely. So our sponsor for today is our friends over at Penny Post. Now, we talked about PlannerCon on a previous episode, and it's because we both are stationery and planner lovers. And so Penny Post is an amazing small woman-owned business in Old Town Alexandria in Northern Virginia, and they are for the stationery and planner lovers in our lives. They are inspired by the art of personal correspondence, the power of the written word, the smell of freshly printed things, the eclectic, the classic, the handmade, and the everyday and once-in-a-lifetime celebrations. They reconnect us to what matters most, and that is each other. Yeah, and I always send you cards from Penny Post. We love a good handwritten note, something in the mail that's not...
It's really special.
The U.S. government asking for their student loan money. So that's also really
Or their
nice.
taxes.
Or their taxes. There's that. And so we would appreciate if you support the people who support this podcast.
Amazing. Yes, absolutely. They're wonderful. They have a great online business for those followers who can't go in person, though the store is adorable.
It really is.
And really worth a visit if you're in the greater DC area.
Stop by.
Okay. We're at kind of one of my favorite parts of the episode. Today in Dumb Shit Men Say, we have a quote from Arizona Representative Trent Franks. The incidents of rape resulting in pregnancy are very low. What say you?
My response is often like, what does this mean? I don't even understand as something to come out of someone's mouth. What is the summation that you want us to take from this? And we've talked about this a bit and about like this idea that for folks who are pro-life, that they believe that the folks on the left are like inflating certain like necessities of pregnancy termination. So maybe he's saying, well, that's lies and
right, that the
disinformation.
Argument that an unwanted pregnancy from a rape doesn't really happen.
But when it does.
Well, of course it does. And what does it matter? So there's so many layers to unpack, right? Because where is he getting his data? One.
Number one.
And wouldn't one rape resulting in pregnancy be too many?
Well, it's like saying, well, it was just one murder. It was just one incidence of arson.
Right. Or is he saying that rape doesn't occur?
Well, I think there is a strong, as we know, disbelief in people when they come forward and say that they have been raped or sexually assaulted. And so those same people who believe in those talking points then say things like this. And so it's all the same through line, actually.
Yes, absolutely. I think another thing that this quote doesn't even take into consideration, but it's something that we've been talking about and something that I think a lot about, and we're going to talk to our amazing guest today about as well, is the concept of rape. And we have as a society this expectation or this understanding that rape is one way. But what we know is that there are lots of forms of sexual assault, including coercive sexual engagement, right? So someone who might not be forced at gunpoint to have sex, but might be forced through other means and mechanisms.
Absolutely.
And that's something we don't talk a lot about, but happens all the time in all sorts of relationships, including marriages and monogamous relationships, and one that clearly results in unwanted pregnancies.
Exactly. And I think what we'll talk about today, as well as it relates to this quote, is choice. Generally.
Right.
Just choice. Rape, no rape. Coercive sex, no coercive sex. It is choice.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that we've been talking about, we talked about yesterday, is the name of the movements, pro-life, pro-choice, and how that's really problematic because in many ways the pro-life movement is anti-life.
For me, it is an intentional misnomer for the purposes of coercion or for the purposes of not giving female-bodied people the autonomy over their bodies. And so it is quite
Power, subjugation.
intentional.
Okay, we're going to put a pin in that because we're going to talk to our host more about sexual and reproductive health. But before that, we have so much to look forward to. We're coming to the end of our first season, which is amazing.
Yes.
Lots to look forward to. Please subscribe on all platforms. If you're listening, it's important for us to get traction. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Google, Stitcher, and we will continue creating and doing more things.
And don't forget to leave us a review of the podcast and, of course, following us on all platforms.
Yes. And as we come to the end of this season, please stay tuned for more exciting things to happen within the community before we launch again in January.
Absolutely.
Okay. Without further ado, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Megan Evans. I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit about yourself with our listeners.
Yes. So I am an obstetrician and gynecologist. I practice here in Boston at an academic medical center. And I think when I talk about being an OBGYN, it's important for me to say that I practice the full spectrum of reproductive health care. So I take care of people during their pregnancies. I take care of people as they transition to menopause, as they have problematic periods, any sort of things that's bothering them, and just general healthcare maintenance. And I'm also an abortion care provider. The other thing that is part of my niche, my interest, is advocacy, especially when it comes to medicine, because I do think as physicians, and especially in today's, what's happening in our political climate, is as an OBGYN, it's part of our jobs. It's part of our jobs to be advocates, to speak out on behalf of our patients, to speak out on behalf of our communities. So that is a huge part of my practice and my interests. And obviously, Margo and I have delved into that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so we'll link an article that we wrote in the show notes. Megan and I reconnected in COVID, which was wonderful. And we were able to write an article together about accessing populations who are impacted by intimate partner violence through the pandemic, and particularly in a healthcare setting. There's a lot of funny parts about this. Well, I mean, the most beautiful part is that Megan and I reconnected after not having seen each other basically since college.
Oh, wow.
Megan asked me if I wanted to write this article, and she had all these stipulations, like it can't be more than 5 pages. We can't do more than 5 sites. And I was like, okay, this is weird. Like doctors write things very differently than lawyers, because lawyers basically write 45-page articles about nothing and overly cite everything, and like create some esoteric theme that no one understands or really reads about. And so I was thrilled, and then it got placed, and I didn't understand the gravity of where the placement.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when you write articles, you shoot for the stars, and New England Journal of Medicine was where we submitted. And normally they reject you in 2 days, and then you move on to the next one. And then it was 5 days, 7 days. And I'm like, oh, something's happening here. And then they accepted it and published it. And Margo was, is that good? Is that a big deal? Which is it's like the pinnacle of publishing, especially in medicine. And it's been viewed 250,000 times last time I checked. So...
And also quoted by Vogue,
yes.
you should say,
Vogue.
as well.
That's,
I mean, y'all are a
really,
big deal.
Your bucket list was New England Journal of Medicine.
Yes.
My bucket list
was Vogue?
Vogue and People.
Oh, for sure. And you got both.
I got both last year.
Look
Wow.
at that.
Yeah. In this.
Yeah.
Here we are in my other bucket list.
Number 3.
Number 3. Working with my best friend. Okay. Can we jump into it? We have so much to cover.
There's so much to say. Dr. Megan.
Yes.
You mentioned about, and I really appreciate this, about what it means to be an OBGYN, like through the lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned menopause. And so as our listeners know, Margo and I have both been touched by breast cancer, and particularly my cancer type was estrogen driven. And so I had to take a medication initially called Lupron, now into tamoxifen. Obviously, it extracted, zapped all the estrogen out my body. Girl, my coochie was so dry. It was so dry. And so now I'm thinking about, like, as I get closer to perimenopause and menopause outside of the medically induced, like, what do we do to kind of keep the sensations, keep the juices flowing, keep things hot and spicy when you feel like the Sahara Desert?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And I think what's sad is that so many patients that I talk to, whether they've had your journey or not, they think that it's just something that happens, something that they don't get to continue to enjoy sex the way they used to when they were younger. But there are so many different things that we can provide patients and we can talk to them about. So I think sometimes with the history of breast cancer, it's a little bit more complicated, especially since you had the estrogen receptor positive. But, oftentimes we're talking to patients about lubrications. We're talking about vaginal estrogen, which for a lot of people, there are very few contraindications for them to take. And so that actually can totally change how patients approach their own sexuality, their own sex life, when they're in that perimenopause, menopause time. And that's also true for systemic hormone replacement therapy. Sometimes that is a game changer for patients.
What does that mean, systemic hormone replacement
So
therapy?
vaginal estrogen is very local to the vagina, where you can take estrogen and progesterone and, depending on if you're eligible for those things, while you're transitioning through menopause. So for some patients, and it may not be right for everyone, but some patients might take estrogen and or progesterone. If progesterone you need to take if you have a uterus. If you don't have a uterus, you don't need to take progesterone. And so for many patients who are going through menopause, some people sail right through it. They don't notice anything different. Other people, it's a very challenging time for them. They have, we call vasomotor symptoms, so that hot flashing that people talk about, which I'm sure you experienced on your medication, even if it was temporary, not pleasant. And then mood changes can happen. Sometimes people experience weight gain, sometimes decreased libido. All of those things are something that I think it's important that providers talk to patients about. And I hope patients feel empowered to bring up in their visit, because I don't always think that happens.
Or that it's not just something that happens.
Right.
I think that, a lot of the narrative that I adopted is that you go through this thing, this change.
Yeah.
And like all these things just happen to you and you have no choice.
Right. I think similarly, I ask patients if they leak urine when they laugh, cough, or sneeze, because so many women think that that's just part of getting older. And I'm always surprised with how many people are like, oh, that does happen to me and it does bother me, but they weren't going to bring it up. I asked them.
I was about to say that. Do you find that...
No one's ever asked me that.
Yeah, no one's ever asked me that either.
Yes. Well, not anymore. Actually, not anymore, because I did pelvic floor PT. But that was only because I had my surgery and the PT asked.
Right.
So do you find, no matter the age, that your patients are a little nervous about talking about their sexual health with you?
I think it depends. I think there's some patients that come in and they're very comfortable talking about those things right away. And I think some patients aren't. And what's unique about OBGYN is that I have to develop a relationship with you within seconds of walking in, so you can feel comfortable asking those questions. And maybe that doesn't happen in the first visit. Maybe it's something that we develop over time. But, that's what's interesting about this field, is that we ask very sensitive questions and we do very sensitive exams within 20 minutes of meeting someone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's really weird. Not you. It's just like when you think about it.
For a patient.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, my
nice
name
to
is
meet
blah,
you.
blah, blah.
Get undressed.
Yeah,
Right.
we're at third base.
I'm just going to penetrate your vagina.
That's all.
In a respectful
of
manner.
course. No, but
you're
like
consensual manner.
Right, in a
Absolutely.
consensual, but in like bright lights and at 10:30 in the morning. It's very strange.
Yes.
Well, I want to ask one more question before we get to another topic, because when I first met you, I asked you a question that we brought up on a previous episode, which was about my goal of squirting. And we talked about that. So I'm happy to say that my coochie is no longer super dry, Dr. Megan.
Good. Glad to hear that.
Okay, good. It's now sitting on Super Soaker. And I feel like it may be ready for the squirtage. Okay, so you were giving some advice about that. And can you bring that up here? Because I think our viewers and listeners could really benefit from it.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. After we had that conversation that night, I was like, I'm just going to do my a little bit more research too. And I think what's sad about it is I think that there's still not a lot known about
Shocking.
the potential.
There's not a lot known about
this is your next
sexual
article
pleasure.
for the New England Journal of Medicine.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. And I saw some quote that only 15% to 50% of women are able to squirt.
Okay.
But how do you know that? And I think that's what's, kind of speaks to the whole topic, in that.
How do you know? Because some women, first of all, have never experienced orgasm.
Exactly. Right. And may not feel comfortable ever taking themselves to that place. So it could be 100% of people have the ability to do that, but we just don't know. So tell me what your specific question is.
Well, so I remember you were talking about, we had this conversation about needing to push if you feel like you need to urinate during sex.
I didn't mean physically push. I meant like go past that point.
Oh, mentally push.
Yeah. So,
girl, I've been peeing on everybody. I thought you meant literally push. Shit. I'm so happy this came up. Okay.
Yeah, I meant more like you get to that point, where people climax and then you can stop. And so I think that for some people who want to explore that in themselves, that to keep going past that initial climax.
Oh, okay.
Like when it feels too much.
Like it feels too much and it's pleasurable. It shouldn't be painful, right?
Of course.
But,
nothing.
But that you kind of push past that point.
I also thought you meant
push, like
literally push.
Yeah.
But see, I don't have this.
No, now
so
clear when this comes up again.
So there's something we're going to put a pin in this again because we have so much to cover with you. But I want to put a pin in the squirting conversation for Tashira because I have been getting a lot of feedback on that episode. And some feedback has been that, like, why squirt? That's like a male thing. Is that the patriarchy telling you to show pleasure, you have to ejaculate? Like, what about a full body quiver?
Yeah.
Like, why can't men do that?
Yeah.
Like right? So let's just put a pin in that.
Okay, let's do so.
Like sex and dating in our 40s. Maybe we'll have you back. But we really need to get to some of these questions.
Yeah.
Megan, do you feel comfortable telling us to what extent you're involved in the abortion access movement?
Sure. I'll tell you that my involvement in reproductive rights, abortion access has been a long time. I think
since when we were in college.
Yeah. So I was involved in Wellesley Women for Choice at Wellesley College and went to the March for Our Lives, I think. I forgot the exact name, but it was in 2004, which nothing's really changed. If anything, we've gone backwards since then.
Yeah.
I worked at a community health center in the area for 3 years, and then I went to med school in DC. And when I went to medical school, I got involved with Medical Students for Choice, and then really found how important that work was because for the medical students, whether they went into OBGYN or not, or whether they were going to provide, we all take care of patients who have had abortions, are seeking abortions, no matter what field you go into. So it was important that we, educated ourselves and made sure that people were comfortable with the topic of abortion, talking to patients about abortion. During medical school, I became the national president of Medical Students for Choice, which was an interesting time because it was when Dr. George Tiller was murdered at his church in Kansas. And I knew where I wanted to go to residency, it was critical that I was trained in abortion services because abortion is part of reproductive healthcare. Abortion is healthcare. I have saved people's lives by providing abortion. So I went to a residency in the Boston area. I was very well trained in abortion services. And since then, in residency, medical school, and now I prioritize making sure that our patients, whether it's here or across the country, continue to have access to reproductive health services, no matter why they're seeking them.
Yeah.
So that brings a question that we've talked about, and I wonder your position on it, or maybe even not your personal position, but the rhetoric around it about medically necessary abortions to save the host's, the mother's life versus induced abortions because people have an unwanted pregnancy.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of conversation with what's going on now that people can't access medically necessary abortions. I worry, and I want your opinion to share too, about whether we're having this conversation all wrong, that we shouldn't be making a distinction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the stories that we're hearing in the media are these tragic stories of patients who need an abortion to save their lives or to prevent them from getting a hysterectomy. And those are the stories that are, people are really focusing on. I think that what we don't want to do is make good abortions and bad abortions. And so we never want to put people in this bucket, well, oh, you just don't want to be pregnant, and so you're seeking an abortion. But we talk about life-saving abortions, not this patient in front of you who cannot afford to have another child. You could be saving
their
her
life,
life, right?
And that of her children if she has other children.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Or she's in a domestic violence situation.
Wow.
We know that violence increases during pregnancy. So by providing that termination, you could be saving her life. Like, abortion in a lot of cases is an act of love. And so I think that that is really important to think about when patients are accessing. And, Dr. Tiller, who I mentioned earlier, his whole premise was trust women. So trust the person in front of you and why they're seeking that procedure. I don't need to ask why you're here. You have already decided on your own. People don't just wake up one morning and say, I don't want to be pregnant anymore. That doesn't happen, right? It is a hard decision for many people, and they've already decided that this is the best thing for them.
There's so many similarities and overlaps, I think, between abortion, the work of an abortion provider, and doing anti-violence work. I used to talk all the time that no one chooses to be in an intimate partner violence situation.
Right.
No one wants to be a victim of sexual harassment or sexual assault. And so the rhetoric from some of the oppositional forces that we encountered in advocacy work is like, oh, people are creating this or they're making this up. And it's like, no one wants to go into a police station and file a frivolous report.
Right.
You have to believe women. You have to believe victims of violence. And sure, there's the one-off. I mean, in all situations, there are people who struggle with mental illness or maybe credibility issues, but that's not what the focus should be.
I want to share my abortion stories because I think they speak especially to what you two are talking about. So my first abortion was when I was 19. My boyfriend at the time and I were transitioning, through our relationship. I was getting ready to graduate from college. Can't imagine being in such a precarious time of my life and having carried this pregnancy to term. My mother was a very young parent at that time. So when I was 19, my mom was still in her early to mid 30s. And generationally, I understand how poverty works. And so whereas at that point, my family had become pretty comfortably middle class, it just takes one unwanted pregnancy, one kind of lapse in education. This whole idea of socioeconomic status is so fragile in this country that we could have very easily lapsed back into poverty without the proper resources to support me as a child and my child, right?
Because you were still a child.
Because I was still a child. And so terminated that pregnancy. It was my aunt who helped guide me through it. I had no idea what to do, where to go, how to do it. Later in life, I end up in a very toxic, abusive relationship. I am in my late 20s, maybe almost 30, but definitely around late 20s. End up pregnant. And I remember that I realized I was pregnant at the point that I had left my abuser. And there was no way that I was going to be able to have a child and continue to separate myself from him. I mean, he would have had a right to a child, right? I couldn't have legally done that. In most cases, I could not have legally done that. And so it would have connected me for the rest of my life to the person that was abusing me, right? So in my mind, both acts were necessary, but even if they hadn't have been necessary, I had the right to fucking choose because it's my body, no matter the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, what's happening right now across the country is abortion bans or laws that are passed that severely restrict access to abortion and taking away that choice, where the reality is that people who have the means will always be able to get their abortion. They will be able to fly to
a private health clinic and get their abortion and stay in a nice hotel and go to the spa and be fine.
Exactly. Yep. It is poor women. It is women of color who have
no transportation,
childcare, and there's so many layers to racism, white supremacy, from these bills, this oppression, that I think that's what people, two things are so clear. One is that this isn't about life, right? This isn't about the fetus. This isn't about that child. Children. It's not about children, because these are the same states that have the highest child poverty, the highest infant mortality, all of those things.
Maternal mortality,
which is going to rise because of these legislation. It's not about life, right? Exactly.
We can go state by state, but we have no robust social services for child well-being. We
Right.
have no universal right to childcare. We have no universal right to safe, clean water. We have no universal right to healthy food. We have no universal right to good schools.
Right.
Right. And so
this is about power. This is about controlling bodies. Yeah.
Right. And this is about controlling female bodies.
Yes.
And keeping women and women of color poor.
Yes.
Oh,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, because I often think to myself, this kind of welfare queen stereotype that still informs legislation to this day in public policy. Why would you want to restrict my access to reproductive healthcare in all forms, including abortion, if you really think I just want to live off the government, right? These two things should be contradictory. No, you just want to demonize Black bodies. We live in a society of anti-Blackness, and you want to control a woman's body.
Yep, exactly. And I also want to thank you for sharing your abortion stories, because I do think that is a really hard thing for people to talk about. And I think no matter how much we try to make that, being able to share your abortion story, because it's so common, right?
Yeah.
Between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women have had an abortion. It's still stigmatized. People will still judge you for that. And so I think that you telling your story is so powerful.
I agree.
And that, more people, there's going to be so many people that listen to your podcast that have had an abortion who've never told anyone, or who've told very few people. And you might empower them to tell their story.
I hope so, Dr. Megan. Thank you.
I agree. 100%. And I think that one of the things that we're trying to do in this podcast is be transparent about our experiences, both the good, the hard, the choices that we've made, to have a conversation around them. It's one of the reasons that I think having a conversation about abortion access and medical access feels so important to Tashira and myself. I think also, I've said this before as well, like being a mother has made me so much more of a fierce abortion advocate, because it's something that is so hard and so permanent and so beautiful if it's wanted, and nothing anyone should be forced to do.
Right. It should be a choice.
It should be a
yes.
choice.
Whether you want to continue that pregnancy, that is a choice. It should not be forced upon you.
And let me just say that I think for us on the left that we understand also, I hope, that choice works both ways. So it can be the choice to carry the term or the choice not to. And so my story, as I mentioned, I'm a very young mother, and my father at the time was not ready, had still, has some issues to this day. And so he pressured my mom to have an abortion at 16 when she was pregnant, at 17 when she had me, and she refused. And my grandparents stood in the gap and helped to raise me, other members of my family and my community. And I think that's just as powerful as given her the opportunity and the option to terminate the pregnancy.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Both ways.
It works both ways.
I think it's also important to recognize that the people who are creating this legislation, passing this legislation, have truly no idea how the female body works. And so we see this with examples of ectopic pregnancies. Ectopic pregnancies are pregnancies that are outside of the uterus. They are not viable. You cannot continue an ectopic pregnancy.
And it will kill.
And it could kill you. Exactly. And so to have legislators say crazy things about transplanting the pregnancy and the fallopian tube to the uterus, which is medically impossible, and trying to pass legislation that requires physicians to do that, it just shows that they have no concept of actually how reproduction works, even though they're trying to control it.
Yeah, and there have been, and I don't remember who said this, but it was this idea that if a pregnancy occurs because of a rape, or that a pregnancy is less likely to occur as a result
Of
of
a
a
rape.
rape. As if like
Right.
the female body as a
can
host
control.
will reject the sperm.
Yeah, what is
Yeah.
that?
Well, so obviously not true, and I think I think that stems from people being kind of outraged that they want to make it so that you would also have to continue the pregnancy if you were sexually assaulted, raped. And so them saying like, well, that barely ever happened. So do we really need to make that an exception when we know it does? 100,000 plus pregnancies, potentially a year, could result from sexual assault, even though if it's not what they're visioning as someone, jumping out from the bushes and sexually assaulting someone, which we know is.
So one of the things that I think is hard to talk about, but it's fascinating to me, and I know results in a lot of unwanted pregnancies. I want to hear your medical perspective or your practice perspective, is the concept of coercive sex and partners screwing with people's birth control. Because that was such a common thing I saw in my practice. This kind of idea of people throwing like birth control pills out or not letting someone have access to their birth control, or refusing to wear a condom, or putting on a condom and then taking off the condom right before ejaculation, and coercive sex, which happens all the time. And I argue, and as per law, it is sexual assault, but it doesn't have the same weight for whatever reason as a physical forced rape.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of touches on what you were all talking about earlier, is women. And I want to clarify that when I say women, I do want to include people who identify as women too, or who were born female but have transitioned to identify as a different gender. I think that it comes down to like what women deem as pleasure, what they deem as their, relationship, and what's appropriate. And I do think that so much, and I was listening to one of your earlier episodes about sex, and how you were saying, Tashira, that so much of like what women are taught is that sexual education, right? Like you have, vaginal sex and he climaxes. There's never the part of like female pleasure, female orgasm has been totally left out. And I think that so much of that coercion, I'm sure many women wouldn't identify it as coercion. For sure. And it's just like, it's the agreement that you had when you entered this relationship that if he wanted sex but you didn't, sometimes you just have to oblige. And I think I hope over time there's more empowerment of patients and women identifying that, this is what I want, and this is what, and that actually will probably help in so many relationships, identifying what each individual values. But, I think again, with that other side of coercion, with the contraception, the condoms, I mean, again, it's about control and controlling bodies. And the fear, people use contraception to prevent pregnancy. And so to have someone take that component where the patient individually has her own control of that, I mean, that is something that I don't think is talked about and is very concerning.
Right. I mean, well, this in and of itself is like a direct overlap with violence, right? When you think about intimate partner violence, you think about a power differential, or someone who exerts more power over someone else through different means. Physical means is one, sexual means is another, but you can do it through all forms of behavior, including intimidation or isolation, or limiting access to your own body. Is a direct form of abuse.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's violent. And let me also say, I think what stems from that too, for me, Margo, is who are the primary caretakers of children? And so if I'm being forced, either because of coercion or abuse or whatever it may be, to carry a child to term, the child then comes, it likely is going to be the female-bodied person in the relationship's responsibility for the caretaking. And so this has decades, and as you mentioned, a lifetime impact on how we navigate and move in the world.
Yeah, totally. And through our own life, and through access to our own economic resources, or our own home, our own, I was saying to Tashira the other week, we were talking, and I was like, I just want to have like an hour in my home alone. And
Yeah.
Tashara was like, well, why don't you just do that? And I was like, actually, that's not possible for me right now. There's someone, and it's a beautiful thing. Like we live around family. We have 3 children. My husband and I are both working from home.
Yeah.
Right. There are a lot of people in our home. That's a beautiful, amazing thing.
But you
Sometimes
need time for yourself.
sometimes
Yeah.
in my home.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Absolutely.
it's just an interesting, but like those are choices that I made. If I didn't have access to those choices and this was foisted on me and I still had that desire to be alone, how would I feel?
What would you do?
What would I do?
Mhm.
I'd like run away or something.
Yeah, and I mean, it keeps going back to the topic that I think we're touching on around the resources once again. So let me ask y'all a question. When it gets down to this idea of like forms of birth control, like IUDs,
Yeah.
the pill, etc., do you think that we should also be talking about abortions within that same vein? And if so, how do we get there as far as it being a form of not just reproductive health, but also pregnancy management, life planning management, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's certainly, I think with the increase in access to mifepristone, which is the abortion medication, I think patients have a little
Is that
bit.
the morning after pill?
No. So
Oh.
the morning after pill is Plan B or Ella, kind of erroneously dubbed the morning after, mostly just because, I think you had unprotected sex and you can take this pill, but, the sooner the better. And, obviously to prevent a pregnancy. So the morning after pill, Plan B or Ella, they work in different ways, but the purpose is to prevent ovulation. Whereas mifepristone, which is an abortion medication, ends a developing pregnancy. And so I think that sometimes you'll even see legislators mix those up and try to ban a medication that actually is the opposite, doing not what they think. Right. So, I think that what's come of a lot of these bans is that patients can access mifepristone through the mail. We're seeing a lot of actually mifepristone being purchased by American women overseas and being sent to their homes, and so they're doing more self-managed abortions in their own communities without seeking healthcare locally because of the legislation, because of the fear around that. I think so many people think of contraception as just birth control pills, but there's so many incredible options. And I think now we know with LARC, which is long-acting reversible contraception, that's IUDs. There's now 5 different types of IUDs. Nexplanon, which is a small rod that goes underneath the skin. Those methods are over 99% effective in preventing pregnancy, reversible, and in some cases, undetectable. If you had a non-hormonal IUD, it could last for 12 years. Your partner could never know, if you were concerned about an undesired pregnancy. So I think, there's certainly that can be an access issue, but we have seen a huge increase in requests for those methods since the Dobbs decision. And since actually, some people have come into office for fear that contraception will be the next target. It is the next target. I mean, let's be honest.
So that was my next question. What's the slippery slope? Is it contraception? Is it IVF?
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm actually shocked that IVF hasn't been more talked about
Yeah.
in this discussion. Not that I want it to be. I want people to have access to whatever sorts of reproductive healthcare that they need, particularly if they're struggling with infertility. But my understanding is a lot of IVF is freezing embryos.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're right. I mean, I think that has the fear for many people who are, potentially have infertility, are seeking infertility services, and may not even know that they're going to need those services in the future, because certainly we don't always anticipate that we're going to struggle, right? I mean, you spend so much of your time trying not to get pregnant, and then I think people don't always expect that they'll have trouble. So the question really is the embryo and it being frozen, and what happens with that embryo, because some people identify that embryo as a life equal to you and me. So that's where it gets really complicated. And I think there's attempts that we might start to see in the future, which I think is far more scary, of personhood, of giving rights to embryos.
I just think that's fucking ridiculous.
So I was going to say, I also think it's fucking ridiculous. I'm wondering if there's something more nefarious going on, even with the lack of focus on IVF, because who accesses IVF?
I mean, this is definitely something that people of a certain class have the
A-
ability to
Right,
even
because in a lot of
access.
states, IVF is not covered.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
And so,
Mhm.
So that goes across the political spectrum, you know.
right. So a lot of these politicians' wives are struggling with infertility, have struggled with infertility. They're accessing infertility services through IVF.
There's a particular interest, of course.
Yeah.
So, but speaking of politicians and just the entire political landscape, for you, Dr. Megan, as a practitioner and also an advocate, what can people do now post Dobbs reversing Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've gone so far over to banning abortions in certain states, decreasing access. How far can we go before people say this is too far? So there's that. I do think that, especially we're in a state that, is deemed safe. We have access. We're trying to expand access to patients traveling here. So for those of us in safe states, I think the biggest thing I would say is for people to not only continue to talk about abortions, share stories, but also put money into abortion funds, because abortion funds have been around for a long time. They provide patients with the financial ability to travel out of state, but not just pay for the procedure, childcare, transportation, food, right? All the layers that come with seeking that procedure. So I often encourage people to not think about those huge national organizations, but the boots on the ground, putting money into that. And then, continuing those hard conversations. Thanksgiving's coming up, having those conversations,
real
That's
talk.
right.
Around the table. And we all have friends who have had abortions. And,
Oh, for sure.
And they have too. Let's be honest, they have too.
So that's the other thing. Like, I think Herschel Walker is, we've talked about Herschel Walker a little bit in this. I also think it's having really transparent conversations about people in power who've accessed these medical services and then are voting and moving on a platform that goes in the opposite of what they've done.
Right. I mean, the reality is that, I'm sure that's the case with, former people in power, but they will always be able to get those services, for their family members, for their daughters, for their mistresses. They will always happen, right? And I think that's the disconnect, I think, for people, is that it doesn't really impact me, or I don't think it's going to impact me. But who is it going to impact? And that speaks volumes of kind of where we are right now in the country.
And I also think, like, we don't want hypocritical politicians, as just a matter of fact, right? We don't want hypocritical leaders, whether it's in faith-based institutions or politics or corporations, nonprofits, etc. But I think it's a slippery slope to kind of like out someone for having paid for an abortion, had an abortion, because what we're really trying to do, I think those of us who are on this side of justice, is to just normalize it all. And so in some ways, I don't know that I want to be the one who's like outing or pushing for Herschel Walker's ex's, abortion receipts, or asking for these people to speak on public platforms, because it is a medical procedure that happened, and it shouldn't be seen as something that is an outlier or something that is, for all the reasons that we've discussed today, dirty women, bad people have it. No, he paid for an abortion, as he probably should have, given whatever the circumstances were at the time. Yeah.
I don't know if I agree with you. I mean, I think in an ideal world, I do agree with you. Like, I obviously think that this medical procedure should be normalized. I have such a visceral reaction to the moral purity that the right is running on around
sure.
abortion, and the fact that it's so hypocritical. And I mean, you're right? Like, that it shouldn't be something like, show me your receipts. That's stupid. Like, we shouldn't have to live in a society like that where we're outing people or canceling people. But when people are being elected into positions of power and controlling a narrative around best behavior and then doing the opposite in their own life, feels so deeply troubling to me. But
For sure. Well, and that's because we don't agree with them. I think that people who agree, the people who are on that side of the political spectrum, they don't fucking care.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah,
the
I guess
scary
I'm
part.
still just so confused by that.
It's confusion making.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for those of us seeking to provide more support, as you mentioned, for those boots on the ground, what does that look like, especially if you're traveling out of state to have abortion access?
And traveling from a state
That's restricted
Mhm.
or banned. Yeah, I mean, I think, we're definitely seeing a huge increase in abortion services in places like Illinois, in places like New Mexico, a lot of bordering states. And for patients that are traveling there, they often need housing. They often need, especially if they're further along and it might be a multi-day procedure. And I think that that's where you, for those of you who are interested, can connect with those organizations and see how you can help. I think what comes up is like, especially out of Texas, like, are you legally in a bind if you support someone who's seeking an abortion? And the reality is, and obviously you're both lawyers, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the state law doesn't translate into another state. So another state can't prosecute you for or
A
go
Texas
after
law.
right. So a Texas law. But the law is really gray. And
and it's gray on purpose, right? Because they want
For sure.
the chilling effect of the law.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, several things have come from this, and that states like, Massachusetts, New York, they're trying to beef up their protection for their providers. And so that providers, if someone were to seek legal action against a provider who performed an abortion on someone from another state, Massachusetts is basically saying, like, we will protect you.
Oh, good.
That's not true for all states, but that's something that I think we're kind of looking at. The other thing is, like, patients people who support people who are coming from other states, they also shouldn't feel the legal ramifications. The tricky part, and if that patient returns to that state, let's say they return to Texas and they have a complication, I think what's hard is some providers in those states are nervous to provide the care they know how to, their care they're trained to do, because they're worried about, potentially, will they be implicated as helping a patient get an abortion?
And I imagine, as someone who's had lots of gynecological procedures and childbirth, there are always issues.
Yeah, there can
even
be.
in the best case scenario,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Your body heals differently, right?
Yep.
You might still be bleeding. I could imagine so many people who get really good quality care, potentially out of state, coming back and needing a doctor's eyes on their body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
Huh.
I think the other tricky part that we're also seeing is that, I work with residents who are graduated from medical school now, they're doing their training in their field, is that 45% of residents currently are in states that have banned the procedure or have restricted it. And that is a critical skill that OBGYN residents need to learn.
And before, would residents in those states be trained on abortion service?
Just automatically?
Yes. I mean, there are some residents who have chosen to not provide the procedure, but it's also the same procedure of someone who's experienced a miscarriage.
Yeah.
But as I said before, I have saved people's lives with that procedure. And I'm in an institution where there's several of us that provide the procedure, but not all do, and we're in a fairly progressive state with those kind of procedures, whereas there's going to be places where a patient shows up, needs the procedure, and nobody knows how to do it, or nobody has been trained how to do it.
I hadn't even thought of
this
that.
Exactly about how this implicates
the ripple effect
Yeah.
of the lack of
Absolutely.
training.
Students, training, residents,
Nurses.
all of that.
Right. Yep, exactly.
Okay, that is heavy and also mind-blowing and an important reminder of all the work that we have to do. We've mentioned our voting episode. Hopefully you all have already listened to that. We don't know what's going to happen at the polls very soon, but Dr. Megan has given us a very important reminder of how on the state and local level, these policies have huge ripple effects and deal with people's everyday lives. And so we're at a moment where we have to fight back this violence, I think, in every possible
Thank
way.
you for sharing it as violence,
Yeah,
because it is.
exactly.
And
Agreed.
Megan, thank you also for framing the conversation. This has been really helpful, that all abortions are acts of love.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that I've always felt that, but maybe couldn't quite put the words to
Oh,
that.
I love that.
And so I'm really grateful. So one of the things we do to end episodes, particularly episodes, well, all of our episodes, but this episode feels very, very intense. But we either say something that we're feeling or that we're going to do for ourselves. And never at a lack for words, I will start. And I'm feeling really motivated. And I really am very grateful for this conversation because it's helped me reframe how the pro-life movement is really a movement of violence against women. And so when I get that frame, for me, that like is the advocacy work that I've spent the majority of my career doing. And so I think I can continue that really in a very authentic way.
Yeah, love that. What about you? What's one thing you will do for yourself today?
It's such a, sometimes I do have to, I think, like you said, these are heavy conversations. It's a heavy time right now. And, sometimes I just do something that's, I listen to something that has nothing to do with politics or, the state of our world. And I'll listen to like a nice book on tape right now. This is so nerdy, but I'm rereading Harry Potter.
That's so cute. My daughters are reading Harry Potter right now.
Me and your daughters. We'll start a book club together.
Next podcast episode.
No,
the kids one.
Yeah. The kids one.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, 2023.
I love that.
What about you, Tashira?
I am definitely, not just for myself, but for community. I want to look deeper into abortion funds. I have given to national organizations for years, but put my dollars and my time on the local level. And we know how important that is right now, as we've discussed. And the other thing is, I'm excited tonight to have dinner and maybe watch a movie and just relax until the weekend.
Nice.
Beautiful. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.